a brothel on South Wabash Avenue, Chicago. Jacob Guzik sits at a corner table, counting receipts. He's 38 years old, balding, overweight, with thick glasses perched on his nose. He looks like a shopkeeper, a tailor, maybe an accountant, which is exactly what he is. The numbers are good tonight. The girls are working. The customers are spending. Everything is running smoothly. Then Joe Howard walks through the door. Howard is a small-time enforcer, a leg breaker who collects debts for various Southside operators. He's drunk, belligerent, looking for someone to push around. His eyes land on Guzik. The confrontation is brief and brutal. Howard insults Guzik with anti-Semitic slurs. Then he strikes him. Hard. Across the face. The sound echoes through the brothel. The girls freeze. The customers look away. Jacob Guzik sits there stunned, his glasses crooked, his cheek burning red. He doesn't fight back. He doesn't curse. He doesn't move. Because Jacob Guzik has never thrown a punch in his life. He's terrified of violence. Terrified of guns. Terrified of men like Joe Howard. He just sits there, humiliated, while Howard laughs and walks out. Guzik goes directly to Al Capone. 6 hours later, Joe Howard is dead. 2 of Capone's enforcers, likely including Frank Rio, one of Capone's most trusted bodyguards, find Howard in Heine Jacobs' saloon on South Wabash, drinking at the bar. They walk up behind him. Multiple shots ring out. Howard collapses onto the floor, dead before he hits the ground. Witnesses scatter. The bartender disappears. When the police arrive, no one saw anything. No one heard anything. Just another dead thug in a city full of dead thugs. But the message is clear, and Al Capone makes sure everyone in Chicago's underworld hears it. Jacob Guzik is untouchable. Not because he's dangerous, not because he's tough, but because Al Capone has declared him so. From that moment forward, Guzik becomes the most protected man in the Chicago outfit. Touch him, and you die. Insult him, and you die. Even look at him the wrong way, and you might not see tomorrow. Because without Jacob Guzik, there is no Chicago outfit. Without Jacob Guzik, Al Capone is just another violent thug with a Tommy gun and a short life expectancy. Guzik is the mind, the system, the invisible hand that transforms bootlegging from street-level criminality into a multi-million-dollar empire. He doesn't carry a gun. He carries ledgers. And in 1920s Chicago, ledgers are more powerful than bullets. Jacob Guzik was born in 1886 in Kraków, Poland, when it was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His parents were Orthodox Jews who fled the pogroms, the violent anti-Semitic riots that swept through Eastern Europe in the late 19th century. They arrived in America with nothing, settled on Chicago's west side, and tried to build a life in a city that didn't want them. Jacob's father worked as a peddler, pushing a cart through immigrant neighborhoods selling needles, thread, fabric, anything that might earn a few pennies. His mother took in laundry. They lived in a tenement on Maxwell Street, where 8 families shared one bathroom, and the smell of cabbage and coal smoke hung in the air like fog. Jacob was the youngest of 5 children, small, quiet, bookish. While his older brothers hustled on the streets, running errands, shining shoes, stealing when necessary, Jacob stayed inside and read. He taught himself English. He taught himself arithmetic. He understood even as a child that the only way out of the ghetto was through numbers. By the time he was 15, Jacob was working as a clerk in a pharmacy, managing inventory and keeping the books. By 18, he was running a small loan operation out of a storefront on Halsted Street, lending money to immigrants who couldn't get bank loans, charging interest, keeping meticulous records. It was legal. Barely. The line between legitimate business and organized crime in early 20th century Chicago was thin and porous. The same men who ran legal operations often dabbled in illegal ones. Saloon owners ran gambling in back rooms. Pharmacists sold morphine and cocaine under the counter. Loan sharks evolved into extortionists. Jacob Guzik crossed that line gradually, almost imperceptibly. He started managing books for brothels in the Levee District, Chicago's red light zone, where prostitution flourished openly, despite being technically illegal. The madams needed someone trustworthy to count the receipts, track the girls' earnings, and make sure the police got their payoffs on time. Guzik was perfect for the job. Meticulous, discreet, and most importantly, he understood that the real business wasn't sex. It was managing relationships with corrupt cops and politicians. By 1910, Guzik and his brothers, Harry and Alma, controlled several brothels on the South Side. They paid protection money to the First Ward Democratic Organization, run by Alderman Michael Hinky Dink Kenna and Bathhouse John Coughlin, who shielded vice operations in exchange for votes and cash. It was a simple system. The brothels made money. The politicians got a cut. The police looked the other way. And Jacob Guzik kept the books balanced. He was good at it. So good that when Prohibition began in 1920 and the stakes got exponentially higher, the men running Chicago's bootlegging operations came looking for him. January 17, 1920. The Volstead Act takes effect, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages across the United States. Congress intended Prohibition to reduce crime, improve public health, and strengthen American morality. Instead, it created the largest criminal enterprise in American history. Within months, bootleggers were smuggling liquor from Canada, distilling moonshine in urban basements, and brewing beer in hidden warehouses. Speakeasies, illegal bars, sprouted up across every major city, and the men who controlled the liquor supply became millionaires overnight. In Chicago, the bootlegging trade was initially fragmented. Irish gangs controlled the North Side. Italian gangs controlled the South Side. Jewish gangs operated in the West Side. And they all fought each other for territory, customers, and supply routes. The violence was constant and chaotic. Hijackings, shootouts, bombings. Between 1920 and 1923, more than 200 gangsters were killed in Chicago's beer wars. Johnny Torrio saw the waste in all that killing. Torrio was a Brooklyn-born gangster who had built a prostitution and gambling empire on Chicago's South Side. He understood that competition was expensive and consolidation was profitable. So, he called a meeting. In 1923, Torrio gathered representatives from Chicago's major gangs and proposed a radical idea. Stop fighting and divide the city into territories. Each gang would control its own district. They would buy liquor from the same suppliers. They would agree on prices. And they would cooperate to corrupt the police and politicians who could shut them down. It was the birth of organized crime in America. Not just gangs, not just criminals, but a coordinated, business-like criminal syndicate operating with the efficiency of a corporation. And to make it work, Torrio needed someone to manage the money. He chose Jacob Guzik. Guzik wasn't Sicilian. He wasn't Italian at all. In the traditional mafia structure that would later dominate organized crime, this would have disqualified him from leadership. You had to be Italian to be made, formally inducted into the mafia with all the rights and protections that came with it. But in 1920s Chicago, those old-world rules didn't matter yet. The Chicago outfit was a hybrid organization, Italians, Irish, Jews, and Poles working together for profit. What mattered wasn't your ethnicity, it was your competence. And Guzik was supremely competent. Torrio put him in charge of the outfit's financial operations. Guzik set up a system to track every dollar flowing through the organization. Liquor purchases, transportation costs, bribes to police, payoffs to politicians, protection payments to judges, salaries for enforcers, drivers, and accountants. Everything was recorded. Everything was accounted for. Nothing was left to chance. The system worked because Guzik understood something fundamental about organized crime. Violence gets attention, but money buys protection. The newspapers loved to cover gang shootings. The public loved to read about Tommy gun massacres and car bombings. But those spectacular acts of violence brought heat. Police raids, federal investigations, public outcry. What the newspapers didn't cover, what the public never saw, was the quiet, systematic corruption that made the Chicago outfit untouchable. And that corruption ran through Jacob Guzik's ledgers. Guzik maintained what insiders called the Big Book, a master ledger documenting every bribe paid to every cop, politician, and judge in Chicago. The book listed names, amounts, and dates. It was organized by precinct, ward, and political district. It was updated weekly. At its peak in the mid-1920s, The Chicago outfit was paying more than $30 million a year in bribes, roughly $500 million in today's dollars. That money bought protection at every level of government. Beat cops got $20 a week to ignore illegal deliveries. Precinct captains got $500 a month to squash investigations. Detectives got bonuses for tipping off the outfit about raids. Judges got paid to dismiss cases or reduce sentences. Aldermen and city councilmen received campaign contributions in exchange for blocking reform legislation. The mayor of Chicago from 1915 to 1923, William Big Bill Thompson, was effectively on the outfit's payroll. Thompson won elections by mobilizing the machine vote, and the machine vote was controlled by ward bosses who were themselves controlled by gangsters like Torrio and Capone. It was a pyramid of corruption, and Guzik sat at the center, managing the flow of cash that kept the entire structure standing. He worked out of a nondescript office on South Michigan Avenue, arriving every morning at 9 and leaving at 6, just like any other businessman. He wore tailored suits, carried a briefcase, and took lunch at respectable restaurants. To anyone watching, he could have been an insurance broker or a wholesale grocer. But inside that briefcase were ledgers documenting the systematic corruption of an entire city. In 1925, Johnny Torrio retired. He had survived an assassination attempt earlier that year, shot 5 times outside his South Side apartment, and decided he'd had enough. He handed control of the Chicago outfit to his protege, a 26-year-old Brooklyn transplant named Alphonse Gabriel Capone. Al Capone was everything Jacob Guzik was not: charismatic, flamboyant, violent. He wore expensive clothes, drove flashy cars, and loved the spotlight. He gave interviews to reporters, posed for photographs, and cultivated a Robin Hood image. A man who gave booze to working people and thumbed his nose at hypocritical politicians. The public loved him. The newspapers made him a celebrity. And Capone played the role perfectly. But behind the public persona, Capone understood what really mattered: the money. And he understood that keeping the money flowing required someone smarter than him. He needed Jacob Guzik. The relationship between Capone and Guzik was built on cold pragmatism, not friendship. Capone needed Guzik's financial genius. Guzik needed Capone's protection. After the Joe Howard incident, when Capone ordered a man killed for slapping Guzik, their arrangement became ironclad. Guzik was indispensable to the outfit's operations, and Capone made sure everyone understood that hurting Guzik meant death. It was a business relationship that happened to involve absolute loyalty, and it worked. Between 1925 and 1931, the Chicago outfit became the most profitable criminal organization in the world. At its peak, the outfit controlled more than 10,000 speakeasies in Chicago and the surrounding suburbs. They owned breweries, distilleries, and warehouses. They operated gambling houses, brothels, and horse racing wire services. They employed thousands of people: truck drivers, bouncers, bartenders, accountants, lawyers, and enforcers. Annual revenue exceeded $100 million, roughly $1.7 billion in today's dollars. Al Capone personally made an estimated $20 million a year in the late 1920s, making him one of the wealthiest men in America. But none of it would have been possible without infrastructure, without systems, without organization. Jacob Guzik built that infrastructure. He created a purchasing department that bought liquor in bulk from suppliers in Canada, Detroit, and New York. He negotiated prices, arranged transportation, and ensured deliveries arrived on time. He set up distribution networks that moved liquor from warehouses to speakeasies without interference from police. He established quality control standards. Outfit-owned speakeasies served better liquor than competitors, which meant customers kept coming back. He implemented inventory management systems that prevented theft and waste. He hired accountants to track expenses and revenues for every operation. It was organized crime operating with corporate efficiency. And Guzik was the chief operating officer. But Guzik's most important role wasn't managing operations. It was managing corruption. Every week, Guzik met with representatives from police precincts across Chicago. They would arrive at his office, collect envelopes of cash, and provide information in return. Which judges were open to bribes, which prosecutors could be bought, which federal agents were incorruptible and needed to be avoided. Guzik maintained relationships with Cook County politicians at every level, state senators, congressmen, even a few governors. He didn't threaten them. He didn't intimidate them. He just made it clear that cooperation was profitable and resistance was expensive. In 1927, Republican William Hale Big Bill Thompson ran for mayor of Chicago again after a 4-year absence. Thompson was a corrupt, buffoonish figure who openly courted the gangster vote. He promised to keep Chicago wide open, meaning he would not enforce prohibition or crack down on vice. The Chicago outfit backed Thompson's campaign with money and muscle. On Election Day, outfit enforcers encouraged voters in machine-controlled wards to vote the right way. Thompson won in a landslide. Within weeks of taking office, Thompson appointed Daniel Saratella, a close associate of Al Capone, as city sealer, giving the outfit direct influence over city government. Police raids on outfit operations dropped to almost zero. Federal agents operating in Chicago found themselves blocked at every turn by uncooperative local authorities. The corruption was so complete that honest cops couldn't function. When federal prohibition agent Elliot Ness began investigating the outfit in 1929, he had to recruit his team from outside Chicago because he couldn't trust local police. Ness would later write that the Chicago outfit had created a shadow government, an invisible criminal state that operated parallel to legitimate authority. And at the center of that shadow government, counting the money and managing the payoffs, was Jacob Guzik. Guzik's weapon wasn't a gun. It was an envelope of cash. Police officers carried guns. Enforcers carried guns. Even Al Capone carried a gun. But Guzik never did. He didn't need one. He had something more powerful: leverage. If a politician needed campaign funds, Guzik provided them. If a judge needed help with gambling debts, Guzik arranged payment. If a cop's family needed medical care they couldn't afford, Guzik sent money anonymously. He created a web of financial dependencies that made resistance nearly impossible. You didn't work for the outfit because they threatened you. You worked for the outfit because they paid you, helped you, protected you. And once you were in, once you'd accepted that first envelope, there was no getting out. The FBI would later estimate that by 1930, the Chicago outfit had more than 300 Chicago police officers on its payroll. Hundreds more city officials, county employees, and state legislators received regular payments. The corruption extended into the judiciary. Several Cook County judges were later identified as having taken bribes to dismiss or reduce charges against outfit members. It was systematic, it was comprehensive, and it was meticulously documented in Jacob Guzik's ledgers. But Guzik's system had a fatal flaw, and ironically, it was the system itself. By keeping detailed records of every payment, every bribe, every transaction, Guzik created evidence. If those ledgers ever fell into the wrong hands, if federal investigators ever got access to the big book, they would have everything they needed to prosecute not just the gangsters, but the corrupt officials who protected them. Guzik understood this risk. He kept the ledgers locked in a safe. He never let them out of his sight. He used codes and abbreviations to obscure identities, and he destroyed older records regularly to minimize exposure. But he couldn't destroy them all. He needed those records to run the organization. Without documentation, the system would collapse into chaos. And in 1931, that documentation became his undoing, and Al Capone's. The federal government had been trying to prosecute Al Capone for years. They knew he was running the Chicago outfit. They knew he was responsible for hundreds of murders, thousands of illegal liquor sales, and wholesale corruption of local government. But they couldn't prove it. Witnesses refused to testify. Evidence disappeared. Juries were intimidated or bribed. Local prosecutors dropped charges. Even when Capone was arrested, which happened dozens of times, he was always released within hours. The outfit's corruption network, managed by Jacob Guzik, made Capone effectively untouchable. So the federal government changed tactics. In 1929, President Herbert Hoover appointed a special U.S. attorney, George E.Q. Johnson, to lead a task force focused exclusively on bringing down Capone. Johnson realized that prosecuting Capone for murder or bootlegging would never work. The witnesses would die or disappear. The evidence would vanish. But there was one crime that didn't require witnesses or physical evidence: tax evasion. Under federal law, all income, regardless of source, was taxable. That included illegal income. Bootleggers, gamblers, prostitutes, and extortionists were legally required to report their criminal earnings and pay taxes on them. Obviously, almost no one did. But that gave federal prosecutors a powerful tool. If they could prove someone had income and didn't pay taxes on it, they could prosecute them without ever proving how that income was earned. In Capone's case, proving income should have been easy. He lived in a mansion on Prairie Avenue. He wore custom-tailored suits that cost more than most people made in a year. He threw lavish parties, gambled thousands of dollars a night, and traveled in chauffeured limousines. He was clearly wealthy, but proving where the money came from and how much he actually made required documentation. That's where Elliot Ness came in. Ness was a young Prohibition agent, 26 years old, ambitious and idealistic. He had been assigned to the Chicago office in 1928 and was disgusted by the level of corruption he found. He couldn't trust his fellow agents. He couldn't trust the police. He couldn't even trust his own supervisors. So he built his own team. He recruited 9 agents from outside Chicago, men with clean records, men who couldn't be bought. The newspapers would later call them the untouchables. Ness's mission wasn't to arrest Capone directly. It was to gather evidence of the outfit's bootlegging operations that could support a tax evasion case. His team raided breweries, seized trucks, and intercepted liquor shipments. They documented the scale of the outfit's operations, proving that millions of dollars were flowing through the organization. But raids and seizures weren't enough. Johnson needed financial records. He needed ledgers showing income and expenses. He needed proof that Capone was personally profiting from illegal activities. And that meant finding Jacob Guzik's books. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Eddie O'Hare. O'Hare was a legitimate businessman who owned a dog racing track in Cicero, a Chicago suburb that was effectively controlled by Al Capone. O'Hare had business dealings with the outfit, but he wasn't a gangster. He was a father, a family man, and he was worried about his son's future. In 1930, O'Hare's son, Edward Butch O'Hare, was about to enter the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. O'Hare knew that if his connections to the outfit became public, his son's career would be destroyed before it started. So O'Hare made a decision. He contacted federal investigators and offered to cooperate. He provided inside information about the outfit's financial operations. He identified key records and explained how the money flowed through the organization. Most importantly, O'Hare told investigators about Jacob Guzik's ledgers. In March 1930, federal agents raided the Chicago outfit's headquarters at the Lexington Hotel. They seized boxes of documents, receipts, invoices, bank records, and partial ledgers. The records were fragmentary and coded, but they were enough. IRS investigators spent months reconstructing the outfit's finances. They identified bank accounts, traced transactions, and calculated income. They determined that between 1924 and 1929, Al Capone had earned more than $1 million, roughly $17 million in today's dollars, and he had paid zero federal income tax. On June 5, 1931, a federal grand jury indicted Al Capone on 22 counts of income tax evasion. The government was seeking an $80,000 tax bill plus penalties, a staggering sum in 1931, equivalent to more than $1.5 million today. Capone's lawyers tried every trick they knew. They filed motions to dismiss. They challenged the evidence. They attempted to bribe jurors. But federal judge James Wilkerson replaced the entire jury pool at the last minute, preventing the fix. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Prosecutors presented financial records showing Capone's lavish lifestyle and traced the money back to bootlegging operations. Defense attorneys argued that Capone's expenses were exaggerated and that he had paid taxes under different names. The jury didn't buy it. On October 17, 1931, Al Capone was convicted on 5 counts of tax evasion. Judge Wilkerson sentenced him to 11 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever imposed for tax evasion up to that point. Capone appealed. The conviction was upheld. On May 4, 1932, he entered the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. He would later be transferred to Alcatraz, where he served most of his sentence before being released in 1939, his mind destroyed by untreated syphilis. The man who had ruled Chicago through violence and corruption was taken down by accountants. And Jacob Guzik? He was arrested in 1931, the same year as Capone. Federal investigators charged him with income tax evasion using the same financial records that had convicted Capone. Guzik's trial began in November 1931. His defense strategy was calculated and careful. He portrayed himself as an accountant who had failed to properly file taxes due to poor advice from his own accountants. He admitted in general terms to earning substantial income from gambling and other operations, but he never disclosed the inner workings of the outfit, never named names from the big book, and never testified against anyone. It was a masterful performance. Admit just enough to seem cooperative without actually revealing anything useful to prosecutors. He maintained complete silence on operational matters and the corruption network that was his true value to the outfit. The jury convicted him anyway. On December 18, 1931, Judge James Wilkerson sentenced Jacob Guzik to 5 years in federal prison and fined him $17,500, significantly lighter than Capone's sentence, but still substantial. Guzik entered Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in January 1932. He served 3 years before being released on parole in 1935. When he walked out of prison, he walked into a very different world. Al Capone's imprisonment created a power vacuum in the Chicago outfit. Several factions competed for control. Frank Nitti, Capone's former enforcer, emerged as the new boss. But Nitti was a violent man, better at intimidation than administration. The outfit needed someone to manage the money, someone who understood the business, someone with experience, connections, and most importantly, someone who could rebuild the corruption network that had been damaged by the federal prosecutions. They needed Jacob Guzik. Guzik resumed his position as the outfit's financial manager in 1935. But he learned from his mistakes. He no longer kept detailed ledgers. He memorized key information instead of writing it down. He used intermediaries to deliver payoffs, so his name never appeared on official records. He structured bribes as legitimate business expenses, legal fees, consulting payments, campaign contributions. He became even more invisible than before. Under Guzik's management, the Chicago outfit adapted to the end of Prohibition. When the 21st Amendment repealed the Volstead Act in 1933, bootlegging evaporated overnight. But the outfit had diversified. They controlled gambling, both legal and illegal. They ran labor unions and extorted businesses. They infiltrated legitimate industries like construction, trucking, and entertainment. And they went national. By the 1940s, the Chicago outfit had investments in casinos in Las Vegas, Havana, and Hot Springs, Arkansas. They controlled jukebox distribution networks across the Midwest. They ran wire services that transmitted horse racing results to bookmakers nationwide. Jacob Guzik managed the finances for all of it. But Guzik's greatest achievement wasn't financial, it was political. After Al Capone's fall, the outfit realized that visibility was dangerous. Flashy gangsters like Capone attracted attention and investigations. The new model was invisibility. Operate quietly, avoid headlines, and corrupt the system so thoroughly that law enforcement couldn't function. Guzik perfected that model. He cultivated relationships with Chicago's political machine, particularly the Democratic organization that controlled the city. He made campaign contributions to aldermen, state senators, and congressmen. He arranged union endorsements for cooperative politicians. He provided favors, jobs for constituents, donations to local causes, solutions to problems that official channels couldn't solve. In return, the outfit got protection. Not overt protection. No politician could afford to be seen defending gangsters. But passive protection. Investigations that went nowhere. Prosecutors who declined to file charges. Judges who dismissed cases on technicalities. It was corruption by omission, and it was devastatingly effective. The FBI knew the Chicago outfit was still operating. J. Edgar Hoover's agents documented gambling operations, tracked money flows, and identified key figures. But prosecutions were rare and convictions even rarer. Between 1935 and 1955, Jacob Guzik was arrested multiple times, bookmaking charges, conspiracy charges, contempt of court for refusing to testify before grand juries. He paid fines, served short jail sentences, and continued operating. Because the system protected him. The same system he had built in the 1920s, now rebuilt and refined for a new era. In 1946, Frank Nitti committed suicide after being indicted for extorting Hollywood studios. Leadership of the Chicago outfit passed to Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca, both of whom recognized that Jacob Guzik was indispensable. By the early 1950s, Guzik was in his 60s, overweight, suffering from heart problems and diabetes. But he still came to the office every day, still managed the finances, still made the connections that kept the outfit operating. The younger generation of mobsters, Sam Giancana, Marshall Caifano, Felix Aldericio, were violent men who preferred intimidation and murder to negotiate business disputes. Guzik represented the old school, patient, methodical, focused on money rather than violence. In 1950, the Senate Special Committee to Investigate Crime in Interstate Commerce, known as the Kefauver Committee after its chairman, Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee, began holding televised hearings on organized crime. Jacob Guzik was subpoenaed to testify. On October 11, 1950, Guzik appeared before the committee in Chicago. The hearing was televised live. Millions of Americans watched as Guzik, dressed in an expensive suit, calmly invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination more than 140 times. Senator Kefauver asked about his income. Guzik pleaded the Fifth, about his role in the Chicago outfit, Fifth Amendment, about his relationships with corrupt politicians, Fifth Amendment, about the murders of gangsters and witnesses, Fifth Amendment. For 3 hours, Guzik said almost nothing. He was polite, respectful, and utterly uncooperative. The senators expressed frustration. The press called him arrogant, but Guzik didn't care. He knew that talking to federal investigators was more dangerous than any sentence they could impose. He walked out of the hearing room and went back to work. The Kefauver hearings exposed the reach of organized crime in America, but they resulted in few prosecutions. The senators documented corruption, but documentation wasn't evidence that could be used in court. Witnesses refused to testify. Grand juries failed to indict, and the mobsters who appeared before the committee, including Jacob Guzik, simply invoked the Fifth Amendment and walked away. But the hearings did accomplish something. They forced the FBI to take organized crime seriously. For years, J. Edgar Hoover had denied that a national crime syndicate even existed. He insisted that crime was a local problem, best handled by local police. But the Kefauver hearings proved him wrong. They showed that organized crime operated across state lines, corrupted officials at every level of government, and generated billions of dollars in illegal profits. In 1957, Hoover finally authorized a major FBI investigation into organized crime. The Bureau began placing wiretaps, recruiting informants, and building RICO cases against mob leaders. But by then, Jacob Guzik was beyond their reach. February 21, 1956. Jacob Guzik suffers a massive heart attack while sitting in a restaurant on South Michigan Avenue. He's rushed to St. Luke's Hospital, but doctors can't save him. He dies that evening, surrounded by family. He was 70 years old. The newspapers reported his death briefly. The Chicago Tribune called him a key figure in the Capone mob. The Chicago Sun-Times noted that he had been one of Chicago's most notorious racketeers. But the coverage was minimal. Guzik had lived quietly for decades, avoiding the spotlight that had destroyed men like Capone. His funeral was held at a Jewish cemetery on the North Side. More than 200 people attended. Family, friends, and associates from the Chicago outfit. There were no speeches, no eulogies, just a quiet burial for a man who had spent his life in the shadows. The FBI noted his death in their files. So did the Chicago Police Department. But no one mourned him publicly. No one celebrated his passing. He simply disappeared, the way he had lived. Jacob Guzik never carried a gun. He never killed anyone. He never made headlines for spectacular violence or dramatic escapes. But without Jacob Guzik, there is no Al Capone. Without Guzik, the Chicago outfit never evolves from a street gang into a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Without Guzik, organized crime remains disorganized, violent, chaotic, and self-destructive. Guzik brought something to the underworld that had never existed before: corporate discipline. He proved that crime could be managed like a business, with systems, procedures, and accountability. He showed that corruption was more valuable than violence, that bribes were more effective than bullets. His legacy lived on long after his death. The Chicago outfit continued operating for decades, using the organizational model Guzik created. Other crime families across America adopted similar systems: accountants managing finances, lawyers handling legal problems, political fixers managing corruption. The mafia's golden age in the 1950s and 1960s, when organized crime infiltrated labor unions, Hollywood, Las Vegas, and Wall Street, was built on principles Jacob Guzik established in the 1920s. And what of the men who worked with him? Al Capone died in 1947, his mind destroyed by syphilis, barely aware of where he was or who he had been. Frank Nitti committed suicide in 1943, facing a long prison sentence. Eddie O'Hare, the businessman who provided information that helped convict Capone and Guzik, was murdered in 1939, shot to death while driving his car on a Chicago street. The killers were never identified, but everyone knew it was revenge for his cooperation with federal authorities. Tony Accardo ran the Chicago outfit until his death in 1992, dying peacefully of natural causes, one of the few mob bosses to die in bed rather than in prison or from a bullet. And Elliot Ness, the famous Prohibition agent who led the Untouchables? He struggled after Prohibition ended, bouncing between jobs, drinking heavily, and dying broke in 1957, just months after finishing his memoir The Untouchables, which would later be adapted into a famous film. But Jacob Guzik, the scared bookkeeper who never fired a gun, who was slapped in a brothel and avenged by Al Capone's enforcers, outlived most of them. He served his time, rebuilt his operation, and died quietly of natural causes, surrounded by family. There's a saying in organized crime: the man with the gun is just an employee. The man with the ledger is the boss. Jacob Guzik understood that. He built an empire not with violence, but with numbers. He ruled Chicago not by killing people, but by buying them. His weapon was an envelope of cash. His power was knowledge. His legacy was a system that transformed American organized crime from street thugs into sophisticated criminal syndicates. He never wanted glory. He never sought fame. He just wanted to count the money and go home. And for 30 years, that's exactly what he did. Until his heart gave out in a Chicago restaurant, and the man who built an empire in the shadows finally disappeared into them forever. But the story of Jacob Guzik is more than just the biography of a mobster. It's a case study in how criminal organizations evolve, how corruption becomes institutional, and how intelligence can be more valuable than violence. In the popular imagination, organized crime is about Tommy guns and car bombs, about dramatic shootouts and bodies dumped in rivers. The movies love that version. The public loves that version. It's exciting. It's cinematic. But the reality is far more mundane and far more disturbing. The real power of organized crime, the reason it survived and thrived for decades, wasn't violence. It was bureaucracy. It was systems. It was men like Jacob Guzik sitting in offices, managing ledgers, cutting checks, and making sure the right people got paid at the right time. Guzik's genius was understanding that in a democratic system, corruption is just another form of investment. You identify the officials who can help you. You determine what they need: campaign funds, personal loans, help with legal problems. You provide it. And in return, they provide protection. It's not dramatically different from how legitimate businesses lobby politicians. The methods are similar. The only difference is what you're asking them to protect. The Chicago outfit that Guzik helped build in the 1920s became the template for organized crime across America. When Lucky Luciano formed the Commission, the National Organized Crime Syndicate, in the 1930s, he adopted many of the same principles Guzik had pioneered in Chicago: centralized financial management, systematic corruption of law enforcement, investment in legitimate businesses to launder money, diversification beyond a single criminal enterprise. By the 1950s, the mafia controlled significant portions of several American industries. Labor unions, particularly the Teamsters and the International Longshoremen's Association, were heavily infiltrated. The garment industry in New York, the waste management industry, construction, trucking, entertainment, and of course Las Vegas. The casinos that rose in the Nevada desert in the 1940s and 1950s, the Flamingo, the Sands, the Stardust, were financed largely by mob money, often channeled through Teamsters pension funds. The men running those casinos used the same skim techniques that Guzik had perfected in Chicago's speakeasies 30 years earlier. The system worked. For decades, it worked. The mob made billions. Politicians got elected. Law enforcement looked the other way. It only began to fall apart in the 1980s when the federal government finally deployed RICO statutes, racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations laws, that allowed prosecutors to go after entire criminal organizations rather than individual criminals. But by then, Jacob Guzik had been dead for nearly 30 years. There's a particular irony in Guzik's story. He was a Jewish immigrant who came to America fleeing religious persecution. His parents believed in the American dream, the idea that hard work and education could lift you out of poverty, and in a twisted way, Guzik achieved that dream. He lifted himself out of the Maxwell Street ghetto. He became wealthy, powerful, respected within his community. He provided for his family. He died in bed, surrounded by loved ones. But he did it by corrupting the very system his parents had believed in. He turned democracy into a commodity that could be bought and sold. He proved that in America, if you have enough money, you can buy anything, including justice. That's the real legacy of Jacob Guzik. Not the violence, not the crime, but the demonstration that corruption could be systematized, corporatized, made routine. In 1956, when Guzik died, the Chicago outfit was at the height of its power. They controlled gambling across the Midwest. They had investments in Las Vegas, Havana, and Hollywood. They had corrupted law enforcement at every level, local, state, and federal. But the empire Guzik built was already beginning to crumble. The Kefauver hearings had exposed organized crime to the American public. J. Edgar Hoover, who had spent decades denying the mafia's existence, was finally forced to acknowledge it. The FBI began building cases using new investigative techniques, wiretaps, surveillance, informants. In 1957, just a year after Guzik's death, New York State Police stumbled upon a meeting of more than 100 mob bosses in Appalachian, New York. The Appalachian meeting was supposed to be secret, but police discovered it by accident and raided the gathering. Suddenly, the national crime syndicate that Hoover had claimed didn't exist was front-page news. The publicity was catastrophic for the mob. Suddenly, every law enforcement agency in America was under pressure to crack down on organized crime. Federal funding flowed to anti-mob task forces. Prosecutors who had previously ignored the problem suddenly made it their top priority. The era of invisibility was ending. By the 1960s, the FBI had informants inside every major crime family. They were building RICO cases that would eventually dismantle the commission. They were pressuring low-level mobsters to flip and testify against their bosses. The system Guzik built, the system based on loyalty, omerta, and systematic corruption, was breaking down. In 1963, Joseph Valachi became the first made member of the mafia to publicly testify about the organization's structure and operations. His testimony before the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations provided unprecedented insight into how organized crime actually worked. Valachi described the commission. He named the 5 families of New York. He explained how money flowed through the organization. He detailed the corruption of unions, businesses, and politicians. It was everything Jacob Guzik had spent his life keeping secret, now broadcast on national television. More informants followed. In the 1980s, the FBI flipped several high-ranking mobsters, including Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, who testified against John Gotti, the boss of the Gambino crime family. The RICO prosecutions of the 1980s and 1990s devastated the American mafia. Bosses were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Entire crime families were dismantled. By the 2000s, The mafia that had once controlled vast swaths of the American economy was a shadow of its former self, but the model remained. The organizational principles that Guzik pioneered, centralized financial management, systematic corruption, investment in legitimate businesses, didn't disappear. They just migrated to new organizations: Russian organized crime, Mexican drug cartels, Chinese triads, West African fraud networks. Modern criminal organizations still use variations of the system Guzik created in 1920s Chicago. The technology has changed, the methods have evolved, but the fundamental principle remains the same. Money buys protection. Corruption is more valuable than violence, and the man who controls the books controls the organization. There's a gravestone in a Jewish cemetery on Chicago's north side. It's modest, unremarkable. The inscription reads simply, Jacob Guzik, 1886, 1956. No mention of the Chicago outfit. No reference to Al Capone or the millions of dollars that passed through his hands. Just a name and 2 dates. That's how Guzik wanted it. He spent his entire life avoiding attention, staying in the shadows, letting more flamboyant men take the spotlight while he did the real work. In death, as in life, he remained invisible. But his influence is everywhere. Every time a corporation lobbies a politician with campaign contributions, every time a police department gets caught covering up misconduct, every time a public official gets indicted for corruption, you can see echoes of the system Guzik built. He proved that in a democracy, systematic corruption is possible, that institutions can be captured, that the rule of law can be subverted if you have enough money and patience. It's a dark lesson, but it's an important one. The question that haunts Guzik's story is this: could it happen again? Could another criminal organization systematically corrupt an entire city the way the Chicago outfit corrupted Chicago in the 1920s? The optimistic answer is no. Modern law enforcement has tools that didn't exist in Guzik's era: computer databases, DNA analysis, sophisticated financial tracking systems. The RICO statutes give prosecutors powerful weapons against organized crime. Media scrutiny is more intense. Whistleblower protections are stronger. But the pessimistic answer is, it's already happening, just in different forms. Political corruption hasn't disappeared, it's just become more sophisticated. Campaign contributions and lobbying have replaced cash-filled envelopes, but the principle is the same. Money buys access and influence. Organized crime hasn't disappeared, it's just evolved. Drug cartels operate with corporate efficiency. Cybercriminals use technology Guzik couldn't have imagined. Human trafficking networks move millions of people across borders for profit. And the fundamental vulnerability that Guzik exploited, the fact that democratic institutions can be corrupted if enough people are willing to look the other way, still exists. Jacob Guzik died 68 years ago. The world he inhabited, Prohibition-era Chicago, with its speakeasies and machine guns, seems impossibly distant now, like something from a movie or a history book. But the principles he pioneered are timeless. Build systems, not cults of personality. Corruption is more sustainable than violence. Invisibility is strength. The real power is in knowing where the money goes and making sure the right people get paid. These aren't just lessons for criminals. They're lessons about how power actually works in any organization, criminal or legitimate. Politicians understand this. Corporate executives understand this. Anyone who has ever worked in a large bureaucracy understands this. The man with the gun is just an employee. The man with the ledger is the boss. There's a final irony in Guzik's story that needs to be acknowledged. He was a Jewish immigrant in an anti-Semitic era, operating in a criminal underworld dominated by Italians and Irish. He should have been an outsider. He should have been marginalized. But he became indispensable because he had skills they needed. He could manage money, he could keep books, he could navigate bureaucracy, he could corrupt systems without creating chaos. In other words, he succeeded because he was smart. And that perhaps is the most unsettling lesson of Jacob Guzik's life. Intelligence and discipline can be applied to any endeavor, legitimate or criminal. The skills that make someone successful in business can make them successful in crime. The organizational principles that build corporations can build criminal syndicates. Guzik didn't need to be violent. He didn't need to be charismatic. He didn't need to conform to anyone's expectations of what a gangster should be. He just needed to be indispensable. And once you're indispensable, you're untouchable. Today, the Lexington hotel where Guzik kept his office is gone. Demolished in 1995, replaced by a parking lot. The speakeasies he managed have long since closed. The politicians he corrupted are dead. The corruption network he built has been dismantled. But walk through Chicago today, and you can still feel his presence. The way the city works, the machine politics, the pay-to-play culture, the understanding that nothing gets done without the right connections and the right payments, all of that traces back to the system Guzik helped perfect in the 1920s. Chicago isn't unique in this regard. Every major American city has similar stories. New York and the Five Families, Boston and Whitey Bulger, New Orleans and Carlos Marcello, Los Angeles and Mickey Cohen. But Chicago was where the model was perfected, and Jacob Guzik was the architect. In the end, Jacob Guzik's story is about a simple truth. In any organization, criminal or legitimate, the person who controls the money controls everything. Al Capone was the face of the Chicago outfit. He got the headlines, the fame, the legend. But Capone needed Guzik more than Guzik needed Capone. When Capone went to prison, the outfit survived. Because Guzik was still there, managing the money, maintaining the corruption network, keeping the system running. That's power. Not the theatrical, violent power that movies celebrate, but real power. Institutional power. The power to make things happen quietly, efficiently, without drama or attention. Guzik understood that power. He cultivated it. He protected it. And he used it to build one of the most successful criminal enterprises in American history. He did it all without ever carrying a gun, because he didn't need one. He had something far more dangerous. A ledger, a list of names, a network of corruption so complete that the system couldn't function without it. And when he died, quietly, in a hospital bed surrounded by family, he took most of that knowledge with him. The FBI never recovered the big book, the detailed records of who was paid, when, and how much. All of that disappeared. Some of it was probably destroyed. Some of it was memorized by Guzik and died with him. Some of it may still be hidden somewhere, waiting to be discovered. But the system survives, modified, updated, adapted for new times and new technologies, but fundamentally the same. Because Jacob Guzik proved something that can never be unproven. Democratic institutions can be corrupted, systematically, completely, and profitably. All you need is patience, intelligence, and enough money to buy the right people at the right time. That's the legacy of the man who never carried a gun. That's the legacy of Jacob Greasy Thumb Guzik, the accountant who ruled Chicago.